Okay, the last lecture of this unit is on respiration. And really, this goes hand in hand as far as the cycle. So cellular respiration, not respiration as we're sitting here breathing right now, but we're talking about at the cellular level and how that works together with photosynthesis. And I'm gonna point out how those cycle together. Okay, so we need to define what cellular respiration is. And it is the process that releases chemical energy for use by the cell. So it's cellular respiration, okay? Chemical energy. So make sure you remember that's at cellular level. So this is how these two, and they call them biochemical pathways, how they are interconnected as far as the products and the reactants. So if I come up here, here's my chloroplast, okay? So this is in my plant, and photosynthesis is going on. Sunlight's coming in. We talked about thylakoids and stroma, light and dark reactions, and then what is given off, the two products of photosynthesis, is oxygen and glucose. So if you go back to the equation, you'll see how carbon dioxide, water, and light, that's what plants need, are coming in, and then what leaves is oxygen and glucose is stored in the plant or used for starch, and an organism would eat that. Now, as we go on, we're going to look at what's coming into for cellular respiration, and now we're going to focus on the organelle, the mitochondria. So glucose and oxygen are coming in, and what's given off is ATP and carbon dioxide and water. And so those just keep cycling around and around. Now there are two types of respiration, depending if there's oxygen available. So the first one is if there's no oxygen. So usually if we see the prefix "an", that means no. So if it's in an environment, we're talking about an environment where there's no oxygen, then that's anaerobic respiration. And the second one is if there is oxygen, it's called aerobic respiration. So that's why they call it aerobics, because of the oxygen that's being moved through the system. So I'm going to focus a lot on the anaerobic because we're really not that familiar with it. Okay, so if I was to break down anaerobic respiration, which is also fermentation, so these go together, okay, the two types would be alcoholic and lactic acid. So one we're going to see in like plants, and another one we'll see in primarily animals. Now, it doesn't mean that you can't find them in other, but primarily. So if I'm thinking about alcoholic fermentation, that would be when wine or beer ferments, or even bread. That's why bread rises, is because, and we're going to actually do a lab on this, on aerobic respiration, and that's why you have yeast, and so it causes the bread to rise. Now we're going to get to in just a second what this pyruvic acid is, but the main thing is what it makes. So alcoholic fermentation is going to make a special alcohol called ethyl alcohol that you find in wine, beer, bread, etc. Lactic acid fermentation obviously is going to make lactic acid, and we feel this if we have a workout. So if you work out and then you have sore muscles the next day, maybe you haven't worked out in a while or you had a really hard workout, the sore muscles is the result of the buildup of lactic acid on your muscles. That's what causes to be sore. And they usually say to stretch, drink plenty of water to kind of help wash that out of your system. Now, besides being found on your muscles, you can also find it in organism, bacteria. You'll find lactic acid fermentation in our yogurt, and that's what gives it kind of that kind of a bite to it, okay, kind of a twang, if you want to say. Okay, now there's a lot of little notes in a lot of these diagrams. I'm not going to read them to you, but I am going to point out some key things. Okay, so here's glucose, and down here's my mitochondria. So remember, this is cellular respiration. And when I take the glucose molecule that I got from photosynthesis, and let's say I eat something, then that glucose is going to be converted to pyruvate, which is also pyruvic acid. So you can use either term, same thing, okay? And then depending the environment, if it doesn't have oxygen, then it'll go through these two types of respiration, of these two types of fermentation. If it does have oxygen, then it continues on and goes to the mitochondria. Okay, so it has two different pathways depending on the environment. So that's one key thing. So let's take a look at this if the situation where there was anaerobic or the absence of oxygen. So that's what this slide is about. Okay, so glucose, when I convert that to pyruvic acid, the process is called glycolysis. Okay, so by converting glucose to pyruvate or pyruvic acid through glycolysis, I'm going to give off some ATP. Okay, then if I don't have the oxygen, so I'm going to go down, then the pyruvate will go to one of the two types of fermentation. Okay, if it does have oxygen, then it's going to go through a special type of aerobic respiration and then make possibly 34 ATP. So this is where we get a lot of energy, okay, when it's in an oxygen-rich environment and it goes through this type of respiration. Now, I would strongly recommend watching any animations I put up on Moodle, reading quite a few times because it's very confusing, and I understand that. Okay, I mentioned glycolysis of converting the glucose to the pyruvic acid or pyruvate, and so you need to know where it takes place. So if I back up, the glucose is going to come into the cell, and when it's inside the cell in the cytoplasm is where glycolysis takes place, where it's doing that converting of glucose to pyruvic acid. So it doesn't need oxygen, so it could be either in an oxygen-rich or oxygen-poor environment. No matter what, glycolysis is going to start either of the types of respiration, okay, because it's not dependent on oxygen to do that conversion of the glucose. Now, if there is oxygen present, it's going to go through aerobic respiration. And this is a big test question right here. So aerobic respiration takes place in the mitochondria, okay? So I'm going to let you read through this. So you can always pause, okay? So it talks about aerobic respiration, breathing oxygen. That makes sense. So here's the mitochondria, and we know that that is the powerhouse, the energy, and so that is really associated with ATP. And we learned that in our cells chapter. Okay, the Krebs cycle is going to be part of or the main pathway of aerobic respiration. And we just saw that aerobic respiration takes place in the mitochondria. It is also called the citric acid cycle, and that is because that is one of the products. Now, you just kind of need to know they're associated with one another. I'm not going to do a lot with this. We're just covering the surface of these cycles, so don't be overwhelmed. You only need to know what I cover in the lectures, okay, that I ask you to read, primarily the lectures. Now, when you go to take the quiz, I'm going to ask a lot of questions about how these cycles are related to one another. So I would strongly recommend not only using your spiral to take the quiz, unless you totally get this, but just pause the video and write this diagram down in your book, okay, in your spiral. Okay, so let me go through and point out what's going on. So what's on the top here is photosynthesis. On the bottom is aerobic respiration. So we're assuming that we're in an oxygen-rich environment. It's going to the mitochondria. So if I look at my equation, I've got carbon dioxide, water, light. It's coming in. So here's my light is coming in. Light. I need to find the carbon dioxide. So here's my carbon dioxide, which is coming from the mitochondria. And then my water is also coming in, and it is coming from the mitochondria. Okay? Now what's going out from the Calvin cycle, I can even go inside and say light reactions, here's ATP, here's my hydrogen carrier molecule, and then from the light reactions, what is given off is oxygen. Okay? Calvin cycle, that's dark reactions. I'm going to write dark here. Okay, is my glucose. Remember, I have to go through this 6 times to make one sugar. Okay, then the sugar, so here's my sugar and my oxygen. Now, if I come down to my aerobic respiration, let's look at the equation here. Here is my glucose plus my oxygen. Remember, the oxygen is coming from the light reactions of photosynthesis, and it's kind of hard to see, but there's my arrow. It's going to give off carbon dioxide. We breathe out carbon dioxide, so here it's giving off carbon dioxide going into for plants, and then it will give off a lot of energy, and in this case the energy is ATP. Okay, so here's my glucose coming in. Okay, it's going to go through the process of glycolysis. If you go back to a previous slide, make a couple of ATP, convert it to pyruvic or pyruvic acid. It's going to come into the citric acid cycle, which is also called the Krebs cycle. When it goes to the Krebs cycle, the main thing it's going to give off is carbon dioxide, which will go to the dark reaction. Okay? Part of the Krebs cycle, it has a couple of other carrier molecules. We're not going to worry about that. But then it will eventually have something called the electron transport chain. And it's just the chain, these electrons are moving. That's why this mitochondria, remember our mitochondria on our organelle last chapter, we were able to identify it because of this ribbon I told you about. Lining this ribbon are electrons, and that's the electron transport chain, is these electrons move really fast along this ribbon, and when it does that, it charges up and it gives off a lot of ATP. Okay? And then it's going to produce water. So definitely take some time, really go over this, make sure you can follow the pathways. I'm not going to ask you to redraw it, but in the quiz, I will have questions, and this one diagram will help immensely if you understand it. Okay, so here's the Krebs cycle. So this is inside the mitochondria. Okay, so the key thing is I'm not going to go into all these different sugars, all these different molecules. I'm only going to circle so you can see why it's called the cycle. Okay, so if we start right up here where this glucose, okay, so I start with my glucose, through glycolysis is going to convert it to pyruvate, okay, or pyruvic acid. It's going to give off some carbon dioxide. When it goes through the cycle of these carbons breaking and being added to, then here's carbon dioxide leaving, here's carbon dioxide leaving, okay? So it's going to produce carbon dioxide, which is one of the products. And the other thing that it's going to make is some ATP. So those are the big things, the ones I circled that you really need to focus on. So Krebs cycle, also called the citric acid cycle, okay? And then it's in the mitochondria is where it takes place. Okay, so this ATP in the mitochondria for aerobic respiration, how does it break down? Well, glycolysis, converting glucose to pyruvic acid, is going to make 2 ATP. And this is average, like I said, different books have different things. Krebs cycle is going to make a couple. Electron transport chain, and here it even says 34 in your textbook. I've seen 36 and 38. So let's go with the numbers that are on this page. Okay, this is the average. So we're going to say that when it goes through aerobic respiration one time in the mitochondria, because remember mitochondria, energy, organelle, okay, it's going to make 38 ATP molecules using for the plant, or the animal, excuse me. Okay, so this oxidative respiration, that is this whole process with the electron transport chain, the Krebs cycle, so that's where they get the 34 from, okay, and this is the most common. So this is just another diagram. Take some time to make sure to read through this. Okay. So most of it's the electron transport chain. So just kind of a very simple diagram to show you how photosynthesis and respiration are linked together. So we've got the sunlight, we have our producers, our plants, photosynthesis, okay, and it's going to pass the nutrients, that's the purple arrow, onto plants. Animals are going to eat the plants and be consumed, and the energy and heat is given off. Okay, so that's just a really quick diagram. So this ends the lecture notes for this unit. So there's 3 different segments. I'm sorry they were so long, because a lot of things I did say over and over again just to make sure that you were clear on it. So I apologize.